drifting toward disunion, 1854 to 1861. One of the most influential novels ever written in the United States was Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. She was determined to awaken the North to the wickedness of slavery by laying bare its terrible inhumanity, especially by splitting families. It relied on powerful imagery and touching pathos. Deeper sources of her anti-slavery sentiments laid in the evangelical crusades of the Second Great Awakening. Success of the novel at home and abroad was sensational. There were also lengthy runs on stage in Tom shows. No other novel in American history can be compared with it as a political force. When introduced to the president in 1862, Lincoln remarked, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." Stowe never witnessed slavery in the Deep South, but had seen it briefly during her visit to Kentucky. Stowe lived in Ohio, the center of Underground Railroad activity. Uncle Tom left an endearing and enduring impression on the North. Many swore they would have nothing to do with enforcing the fugitive slave law. It was devoured by millions of impressionable youth. It was also immensely popular abroad, especially in Britain and France. Another important book was The Impending Crisis of the South in 1857 by Hinton R. Helper. Hating slavery and blacks, he attempted to prove with statistics that indirectly non-slave-holding whites were the ones who suffered most from the millstone of slavery. After some effort, he finally found a publisher in the North to print his book. It helped fuel fears of planters that the non-slave-holding majority might abandon them. His book was banned in the South. In the North, thousands distributed it as a campaign literature by Republicans. Southerners were embittered when they learned their Northern brethren were spreading wicked lies. Popular Sovereignty and the New England Emigrant Aid Company. The anti-slavery organization sent 2,000 people to Kansas to forestall the South and to make a profit. Many carried the new breech-loading Sharps rifles nicknamed Beecher's Bibles after Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, Harriet Beecher Stowe's brother, who helped raise money to pay for them. Southern spokesmen raised cries of betrayal. Northern Nebraskans were out to abolitionize both Kansas and Nebraska. Some Southern hotheads attempted to assist small groups of well-armed slave owners to Kansas, but planting slavery in Kansas was a losing game. Slaves were valuable and volatile property. It was foolish for owners to take them where bullets were flying. Kansas might be voted free under popular sovereignty. The census of 1860 found only 2 slaves among the 107,000 souls in Kansas and only 15 in Nebraska. Crisis conditions in Kansas rapidly worsened. With the 1855 election for the first territorial legislature, pro-slavery border ruffians poured in from Missouri to vote early and often. Slavery supporters triumphed and set up a puppet government at Shawnee Mission. Free Soilers established an extra-legal regime of their own in Topeka. Bleeding Kansas, 1854 to 1860. Enter every election district in Kansas and vote at the point of a bowie knife or revolver, one pro-slavery agitator exhorted a Missouri crowd. Pro-slavery Missouri Senator David Atchison declared that there are 1,100 men coming over from Platte County to vote, and if that ain't enough, we can send 5,000, enough to kill every goddamned abolitionist in the territory. Confused Kansans had a choice of two governments, one based on fraud, the other on illegality. Tensions mounted as settlers feuded over conflicting land claims. The breaking point came in 1856 when a gang of pro-slavery raiders, alleging provocation, shot up and burned part of the free soil town of Lawrence. This outrage was a prelude to a bloodier tragedy. John Brown now stalked upon the Kansas battlefield. He was obsessively dedicated to the abolitionist cause. Brooding over the attack on Lawrence, he led a band to Pottawatomie Creek in May of 1856. There they hacked to pieces 5 surprised men presumed to be pro-slaveryites. This terrorist butchery besmirched the Free Soil cause and brought vicious retaliation from pro-slavery forces. A civil war erupted in Kansas in 1856. It continued until it merged with the Civil War of 1861 to 1865. Bloody Kansas destroyed millions of dollars worth of property, paralyzed agriculture in certain areas, and cost scores of lives. Kansas applied for statehood on the basis of popular sovereignty. The Lecompton Constitution was a pro-slavery document. People were not allowed to vote for or against the Constitution as a whole. It was a vote for the Constitution either with slavery or with no slavery, but with protections for slavery already there. Whatever the outcome, there would be slavery. Free Soilers boycotted the polls. Pro-slaveryites approved the Constitution with slavery in late 1857. The scene then shifted to Washington. President Pierce had been succeeded by James Buchanan, who was strongly under Southern influence. Buchanan supported the Lecompton Constitution. Senator Douglas threw his support behind true sovereignty. The compromise was to submit the entire Lecompton Constitution to the people. Free Soil voters thronged to the polls and voted it down. Kansas remained a territory until 1861, when Southern secessionists left Congress. Buchanan's action divided the Democratic Party by antagonizing the Democrats in the North. Bleeding Kansas spattered blood on the Senate floor in 1856. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts was a leading abolitionist. He made himself one of the most disliked men in the Senate when he delivered his speech, The Crime Against Kansas. It condemned pro-slavery men and referred insultingly to South Carolina and its Senator Andrew Butler. Congressman Preston Brooks of South Carolina resented the insults to his state and to its senator. To Brooks, the only alternative was to chastise the senator. On May 22, 1856, he approached Sumner and pounded him with an 11-ounce cane until it broke. The House could not muster enough votes to expel Brooks. He resigned, but was triumphantly reelected. Sumner had to go to Europe for treatment of his injuries. For 3.5 years, Massachusetts kept his seat open until Sumner could return. Bleeding Sumner thus joined with Bleeding Kansas as political issues. The Free Soil North was infuriated by Brooks. Copies of Sumner's speech sold by the thousands. Every blow to Sumner made thousands of Republicans. The South was not unanimous in approving Brooks, but they were angered by Sumner's speech. They were also upset that the speech was so applauded in the North. The Sumner-Brooks clash and ensuing reactions revealed how dangerously inflamed passions had become. Blows rained on Sumner were among the first blows of the Civil War. Democrats met in Cincinnati to elect the presidential standard-bearer of 1856. Delegates chose James Buchanan. He was serving in London during the Kansas-Nebraska uproar, therefore Kansas-less. In a crisis that called for giants, he was mediocre, irresolute, and confused. Republicans met in Philadelphia. Higher Law Stewart was a conspicuous leader. However, the final choice was John C. Fremont, the so-called Pathfinder of the West. Virtually without political experience, but he was not tarred with a Kansas brush. Republicans came out strongly against the extension of slavery in the territories. Democrats declared emphatically for popular sovereignty. Ugly anti-foreignism was injected into the campaign. An influx of Irish and German immigrants alarmed nativists who were old-stock Protestants. They organized the Know Nothing Party, so named because of its secretiveness. It was anti-foreign and anti-Catholic. In 1856, they nominated ex-president Millard Fillmore. This threatened to cut into Republican strength. Mudslinging bespattered both candidates. Know Nothing Banner 1856. The Know Nothing Party feared that slavery and other sectional issues were blinding Americans to the real danger in their midst: uncontrolled immigration and foreign influence. The party ran ex-President Millard Fillmore for president in 1856, using banners like this one to alert voters to the threat presented by recent Irish and German immigrants, many of them Catholic. The election returns of 1856. Buchanan polled less than a majority of the popular vote, but won handily. The Electoral College count was 174 to 114 for Fremont and 8 for Fillmore. Why the Republican defeat? Fremont's lack of honesty, capacity, and sound judgment. Also, the Southern threat that the election of a black Republican would be a declaration of war, forcing the South to secede. Many Northerners were thus intimidated to vote for Buchanan. Innate conservatism triumphed, assisted by Southern bullyism. It was fortunate for the Union that secession and the Civil War did not come in 1856. Fremont was ill-balanced and a second-rate figure. In 1856, the North was more willing to let the South depart in peace than in 1860. Dramatic events between 1856 and 1860 aroused still apathetic Northerners to a fighting pitch. The 1856 election cast a long shadow as politicians North and South peered anxiously toward 1860. Dred Scott v. Stanford by Supreme Court on March 6, 1857. The Dred Scott decision was one of the opening paper gun blasts of the Civil War. The case was a simple one. A slave lived for 5 years on free soil. The Supreme Court turned it into a complex political issue when it ruled that Scott was a black slave and not a citizen, and hence could not sue in federal courts. The court could have thrown out the case on these technical grounds. The majority decided to go further. Led by Chief Justice Roger Taney from the slave state of Maryland, the court decreed that because a slave was private property, he or she could be taken into any territory and legally held there in slavery. The reasons were that the Fifth Amendment forbade Congress to deprive people of property without due process of law. The court went still further and ruled that the Compromise of 1820 was unconstitutional. Congress had no power to ban slavery from territories, regardless of what territorial legislatures themselves might want. Southerners delighted with the victory. Champions of popular sovereignty were aghast. Another lethal wedge was driven between northern and southern wings of the once united Democratic Party. The foes of the extension of slavery were infuriated by Dred Scott. They insisted that the ruling was an opinion, not a binding decision. Republicans defied the court because most members of the court were Southern. By entering politics, the court had debased itself. Southerners were inflamed by this defiance. How long could they be joined to a section that refused to honor the Supreme Court? Dred Scott and his wife and daughters, 1857, this slave's long legal battle for his freedom, culminating in the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision in 1857, helped to ignite the Civil War. Widespread publicity about the fate of Scott and his family strengthened anti-slavery sentiment in the North. Articles like this one in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper appealed to the same sentimental regard for the idealized family that Harriet Beecher Stowe so artfully mobilized in Uncle Tom's Cabin. The Panic of 1857. Why did the economy crash? An inpouring of California gold inflated the currency. The demands of the Crimean War in Russia in 1853 through 56 overstimulated grain production. There was a frenzied speculation in land and railroads. Over 5,000 businesses failed. The North and its grain growers were the hardest hit. The South, however, enjoyed favorable cotton prices abroad. The panic further provided proof that cotton was king. It helped drive overconfident Southerners to a shooting showdown. Distress in the North, especially in agriculture, invigorated the call for homesteads of 160 acres from the public domain. Opposition to free farmland came from Eastern industrialists who feared losing workers. The South opposed it because plantation slavery was not possible for only 160 acres. In 1860, Congress passed a Homestead Act. Public land was available for 25 cents an acre. It was killed by President Buchanan's veto. The Panic of 1857 created a clamor for higher tariff rates. But because of a large Treasury surplus, as well as pressure from the South, Congress lowered tariffs in 1857. The tariff of 1857 reduced duties to about 20% on dutiable goods, the lowest point since 1812. As the Treasury surplus melted away, industrialists in the North pointed to a need for higher duties, concerned mostly about the need for increased protection. The Panic of 1857 gave Republicans two surefire economic issues for the 1860 election: protection for the unprotected and farms for the farmless. Illinois senatorial election of 1858 claimed the national spotlight. Senator Stephen Douglas was up for re-election. Republicans ran Springfield lawyer Abraham Lincoln. He was not well educated, but an avid reader. He had married above himself into the influential Todd family of Kentucky, who helped to school him in patience and forbearance. Lincoln emerged as a trial lawyer in Illinois and was widely referred to as Honest Abe. He served an undistinguished term in Congress from 1847 to 1849. But the Kansas-Nebraska Act lit a fire within him, and he emerged as one of the foremost Republican politicians and orators in the Northwest. At the Republican convention in 1856, Lincoln received 100 votes for the vice presidential nomination. Abraham Lincoln, a most uncommon, common man. This daguerreotype is the earliest known photograph of Abraham Lincoln taken at age 37, when he was a frontier lawyer in Springfield and congressman-elect from Illinois. The Lincoln-Douglas debates. Lincoln challenged Douglas to a series of debates. Douglas accepted. They took place from August to October of 1858. The most famous debate was at Freeport, Illinois. Lincoln presented a question based on the Supreme Court ruling and the Dred Scott decision. Douglas had already publicly answered the Freeport question. The little giant did not hesitate to meet the issue head-on, honestly and consistently. The Freeport Doctrine was that no matter how the Supreme Court ruled, slavery would stay down if people voted it down. Laws to protect slavery would have to be passed by territorial legislatures. In the absence of popular approval, slavery would soon disappear. Where public opinion does not support the federal government, as was the case with Jefferson's embargo, law is impossible to enforce. Douglas defeated Lincoln for the Senate seat. His loyalty to popular sovereignty was decisive. Senators were then chosen by state legislatures. Honest Abe emerged as a potential Republican nominee for president. Douglas, in winning Illinois, lost his chances of winning a presidency. The Lincoln-Douglas debates proved to be one of the preliminary battles of the Civil War. John Brown studied the tactics of black rebels Toussaint L'Ouverture and Nat Turner. He hatched a scheme to invade the South secretly, then call upon slaves to rebel and furnish them with arms. He planned to establish a black free state as a sanctuary. At Harper's Ferry, Brown seized a federal arsenal in October of 1859. He killed 7 innocent people, including a free black man, and injured 10 or so more. Slaves failed to rise up, and Brown and his remnants were captured by the U.S. Marines under Robert E. Lee. He was convicted of murder and treason. He marched up the scaffold steps without flinching. His devotion to freedom so inflexible, he took on an exalted character. The effects of Harper's Ferry were inflammatory. To the South, Brown was a murderer and an apostle of treason. They assumed the entire North was filled with Brown-loving Republicans. Moderate Northerners and Republican leaders deplored Brown's actions. Abolitionists and ardent Free Soilers were infuriated by Brown's execution. Free Soil centers in the North tolled bells, fired guns, lowered flags, and held rallies. The ghost of the martyred Brown would not be laid to rest. The Last Moments of John Brown by Thomas Hovington. Sentenced to be hanged, John Brown wrote to his brother, "I am quite cheerful in view of my approaching end, being fully persuaded that I am worth inconceivably more to hang than for any other purpose. I count it all joy. I have fought the good fight, and I have, as I trust, finished my course." This painting of Brown going to his execution may have been inspired by the journalist Horace Greeley, who was not present but wrote that a black woman with a little child stood by the doorway. He stopped for a moment and, stooping, kissed the child. That scene never took place, as Brown was escorted from the jail only by a detachment of soldiers. But this painting has become famous as a kind of allegorical expression of the pathos of Brown's martyrdom, for the abolitionist cause. The presidential election of 1860 was the most fateful in American history. Democrats met in Charleston, South Carolina. Douglas was the leading candidate of the Northern wing. The Southern wing regarded him as a traitor because of the Lecompton Constitution and the Freeport Doctrine. Cotton state delegates walked out. The remaining delegates disbanded after they were unable to generate enough votes to nominate Douglas. The first tragic succession was the succession of Southerners from the Democratic National Convention. The departure became habit-forming. Democrats tried again in Baltimore. Douglas, Democrats were firmly in control. After the Cotton state delegates again withdrew, the rest of the delegates enthusiastically nominated Douglas. His platform came out squarely for popular sovereignty and was against the obstruction of the fugitive slave law by the states. Southern Democrats then selected John Breckinridge as their candidate. Their platform favored the extension of slavery into the territories and the annexation of slave-populated Cuba. The Constitutional Union Party was a middle-of-the-road group. They were sneered at as the do-nothing or old gentleman's party. They wanted a compromise candidate. They met in Baltimore and nominated John Bell of Tennessee for the presidency. Republicans met in Chicago. William Seward was the best-known candidate. His irrepressible conflict speech at Rochester, 1858, ruined his prospects. His enemies repeated the slogan, "Success," rather than Seward. Lincoln of Illinois was the second best, but a strong candidate because he had fewer enemies. He overtook Seward on the third ballot to gain the nomination. His platform made an appeal to every non-Southern group. For the Free Soilers, non-extension of slavery. For the Northern manufacturers, a protective tariff. For the immigrants, no abridgment of rights. For the Northwest, a Pacific Railroad. For the West, internal improvements at the federal expense. For farmers, free homesteads from the public domain. Southern secessionists called Lincoln an abolitionist rail splitter who would split the Union. Lincoln hated slavery, but he was no outright abolitionist. Lincoln enthusiasts staged roaring rallies and parades. Douglas waged a vigorous speaking campaign. Returns proclaimed a sweeping victory for Lincoln. Lincoln was a minority president. 60% of the voters preferred someone else. Lincoln was a sectional president. In 10 southern states, he was not even on the ballot. The election of 1860 was virtually two elections, one for the North and one for the South. South Carolina rejoiced over Lincoln's victory. They now had an excuse to secede. Douglas won only 12 electoral votes, although he campaigned energetically for himself. Douglas and Breckinridge together amassed 365,000 more votes than did Lincoln. The ballot box did not indicate a strong sentiment for secession, however. Breckinridge polled fewer votes in slave states than the combined strength of Douglas and Bell. Breckinridge failed to carry his own state of Kentucky. Even though Republicans had elected Lincoln, they controlled neither the Senate nor the House. The South had a 5-4 majority on the Supreme Court. The U.S. government could not touch slavery in the slave states except by constitutional amendment, which slave states could easily block. Hot passions, not cool reason, began to drive events. South Carolina had threatened to secede if sectional Lincoln won. 4 days after the election, South Carolina called a special convention. They held a meeting in Charleston in December of 1860. The convention voted unanimously to secede. This action set off a chain reaction of secession. The Crittenden Amendments to the Constitution, sponsored by Senator John Jordan Crittenden of Kentucky, was proposed to appease the South. Slavery in the territories north of the 3630 line was banned, but south of the line it would be federally protected in all territories existing or hereafter to be acquired. The future states could come into the Union with or without slavery as they chose. Slavery supporters were guaranteed full rights in the Southern territories regardless of popular sovereignty during the territorial period. Lincoln flatly rejected the Crittenden scheme. Elected on the platform that opposed the extension of slavery, Lincoln felt he could not yield, even if slavery gains might only be temporary. As the Crittenden Compromise failed in early 1861, 6 more Southern states voted to secede: Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. 4 more would join later, bringing the total to 11. The Confederate States of America, formed by 7 seceding states in Montgomery, Alabama, in February of 1861. They chose Jefferson Davis as their president. The crisis deepened by the lame duck interlude. Lincoln could not take office until March 4th, 1861. During this time, the secessionist move gained momentum. Buchanan was blamed for not holding the nation together. He did not believe the Southern states could legally secede, but he could not find any authority in the Constitution for stopping secession by force. Another reason he did not resort to force was that the U.S.'s tiny standing army of 15,000 was needed to control the Indians in the West. Also, the North was not interested in fighting at this time. The weakness was not so much in Buchanan, but in the Constitution and in the Union itself. Ironically, when Lincoln became president, he continued Buchanan's wait-and-see policy. Secessionists left for a number of reasons, most related to slavery. They felt threatened by the North's so-called despotic majority of numbers. They were dismayed by the triumph of the Republican Party, and they were weary of free soil criticism, abolitionist nagging, and Northern interference ranging from the Underground Railroad to John Brown's raid. They supported secession because they felt sure their departure would be unopposed, and they saw secession as a golden opportunity to cast aside generations of vassalage to the North. An independent Dixieland could develop its own banking and shipping and trade directly with Europe. Who could tell when greedy Republicans would pass another oppressive protective tariff? There had been tensions for decades between the North with its manufacturing plants and the South with its agricultural exports. Worldwide impulses of nationalism were fermenting in the South. The principles of self-determination from the Declaration of Independence seemed to many Southerners to apply. Few Southern states felt they were doing anything wrong or immoral. The historical parallel ran deeper. In 1776, 13 American colonies, led by the rebel George Washington, seceded from the British Empire by throwing off the yoke of King George III. In 1860 to 1861, 11 American states led by rebel Jefferson Davis, were seceding from the Union by throwing off the yoke of King Abraham Lincoln. With the Union burden gone, the South was confident that it could work out its own peculiar destiny more quietly, happily, and prosperously. The Eagle's Nest, 1861. The American eagle jealously guards her nest of states and bids defiance to the rebels.